And one of the people who can definitely relate to that is a great friend who I really admire, who is going to facilitate a conversation with us today. Her name is Alexandra Cenatus, and it's my absolute honor to introduce her to you all today. Alexandra, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, awesome. So Alexandra Cenatus is Director of Programs at Maryland Humanities, and works to make the humanities accessible and engaging for diverse audiences. In her research, she examines Haiti's social changes and their impact on Haitian voodoo practices, as well as other aspects of Haitian culture. Cenatus and her collaborators, Margarita Vargas Betancourt and Ivana Moreno, produced the Haitian American Dream Timeline in 2021, which is a digital humanities project aimed at highlighting Haitian immigration to the United States. Cenatus extends her research and programming skills to various communities by advocating for language access and serving as a board member of the Haitian Studies Association, Weave Tales, and the Washington State Coalition for Language Access. On a personal note, Alexandra is one of the best storytellers I know, and someone I deeply, deeply admire. So welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm excited to be in this particular conversation with you today. So one thing I wanted to do before we get started is sort of asking you all a question, and I will add it to the chat. And then so we can actually begin the conversation, because it's going to center around positionality, one, which is like the different layers of your identity. So that can be your race, that can be your gender, it can also be your religion. So when you're actually navigating a space, so that's sort of like who makes you who you are. And it does come with different layers. So one of the things I wanted to sort of talk to you today is sort of first ask you some questions so we can make it a little bit interactive, this short conversation that we have today. And number two, to talk about, because I know, and I even sense, even being in this particular room, people were always mentioning like how they were afraid to be themselves, how maybe judging them or anything. That's also the inability to show up as yourself. So, and then what it can look like when you actually show up as yourself and what can actually be done, I will say. So my first question I have for you, and of course, because of time, we won't be able to get everybody's answers. So excuse me in advance. So my question is, can you provide example of how you have effectively uplifted marginalized stories in perspective other than your own? So an example, look, you can share with me one example where you maybe stood up for somebody else that wasn't yourself, and can anybody in the room can share one or two examples?
I removed your spotlight so we could look at each other. I know everybody in the room does type of advocacy where you uplift the voices of others. So yeah, who would like to share?
Well, I will somebody say something.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I think when I had the opportunity of being at Congress, I spoke from my clients' perspectives, like these people is living, like I didn't mention the name, but I mentioned the stories of them, like an immigrant, she crossed the border walking, she had a kid with disabilities, and we was trying to had the kid in a school, and she was living in a shelter. And then another story of a person that came here with a child, also living in a shelter. So I think another good story I can't remember, it was, I mean, it wasn't because of me, but I can tell, like, if you show out for your clients, then organizations and social worker at the shelter consider this client, because she was supposed to get moved from one shelter to another, and we want to keep the child in the same school with the same transportation, because it was so hard to get him there. And then if they move the child, then there is gonna be like terrible. So I decided to go to the shelter in person to reach for a social worker there and to advocate for my client. because otherwise she will probably move from that place and affect the kid.
Thank you so much, Athena. And I saw somebody mention in the chat that my refugee students and her needs. So these are wonderful examples on how we actually show up when it can be part of our jobs, and we have to advocate for others, but also how we actually show up and advocate for people older than we own and stuff like that. So somebody else, I'm just gonna use that example that Kendra shared in the chat, and then after that, I will move on and sort of talk about what does that look like when you when you're showing up for yourself, but at the same time, you're showing up as well for others. So Kendra mentioned, so I work with the LGBTQI+ population just last week. I had to accompany a refugee to replace their SSS card. They were a bit afraid to do it by themselves because of one, how they were identified, to the language barrier. I did what we had at Rainbow Railroad like to call freeing the system, but educating the service agent about how hard it is for some refugees, particularly queer refugees, to be able to speak up for themselves after coming from a place where they have been silent. And thank you so much, Kendra, for sharing this, because I think all of these stories that all of y'all shared, all of these particular examples, have a lot of connecting threads. So a lot of connecting thread looks like where we are in a space and then we show up to that particular space, sometimes as ourselves, but sometimes depending on our capacity of our job for our clients. And a lot of time we have to educate others about what it looks like to be a refugee, or what it looks like to be an immigrant, and what it looks like to be in this particular situation. And a lot of time, the person may not have the training. Sometimes that's also a decision and is an act of not knowing as well. It's also an act like when the person decides that this is something I'm not interested in, and I do not care about others. So there's a lot of those things that actually happen. And when we come into those particular spaces, then sometimes it definitely can cause harm to ourselves, but also it can cause harm to the clients that we are serving. Because usually a lot of time people think that the racisms or those particular interactions gonna be as big, where you actually will show up and people will say, don't come here. But usually, especially as we are navigating this complicated system, that can be social work or all those particular type of system, and that can be professional work. These are the little details that interact with us that tend to get us, I would say. So part of the things that in those particular interactions that also when I had in different workplaces that I worked at, so I did notice different patterns as well, like where one, people didn't know about what it looks like to be raised from a different culture. Two, what does it like to interact with somebody and stuff like that, older than you, and also someone who has a different language. For instance, I have an accent. What does that mean? So I decided, especially in collaboration with TEL, we actually created this specific toolkit. And this specific toolkit is designed for a lot of organization, institution, businesses to sort of educate them, giving them sort of like practical step. And what does it look like, I will say, to have refugees or immigrants within your organization. So how do you show up for them? How do you make sure that they are well taken care of? How do we make sure that you provide them professional development, for instance, something that some people may not know about? How do we make sure that what the tools, the support, the training that they need is actually provided? But at the same time, when they're giving you input, they're giving you feedback, how you making sure you're not only listening, but you're also implementing these particular type of feedback. So I will say these experiences also similar to a lot of you studied from a personal place, in a sense that how I interacted with different spaces and so on, how they saw me, for instance, and also it also studied based on other experiences that people were sharing with me as well, some patterns that I was noticing, whether with some of the clients that I was serving, as a translator / interpreter, but at the same time, some of all my friends or friends of my friends or other people that they interacted with, and they will say they were relaying, sharing those particular stories with me, and also listening to a lot of those particular stories that you'll share, gathering them and noticing there is a pattern here, and how can we make sure throughout this particular pattern, I use match positionality, which is as a researcher, and understanding like all those particular layers that are part of my identity, whether as a woman, as a Black woman, but I also as an immigrant myself. So how do I use some of that particular, some of them can be a privilege that I have because I have worked in the workplace for a long time compared to someone who's maybe a newcomer. So how do I use some of these experiences that I have in creating this specific toolkit that can actually help other people, that can actually help, I will say, business leaders or also managers to know what is the best way to implement these particular practical steps within their own organization. That doesn't mean they will apply it, but at least that can be a step, I would say, in the right direction. Because one of the things I would say that I always think about, I always believe, we always want to build the world that we want. So what does that look like? Building that particular world that we want. You look like being in a space, not afraid of being yourself, not afraid being with your accent, not afraid showing up with your culture, your history, and so on. And also being respected, being valued, feeling like you are comfortable in this specific, comfortable in that particular space. So if this is a sort of those particular space that we want, how can we make sure the tool is actually a step? How can we make sure that we are creating this specific world, this specific ecosystem that we want, I would say. I think I did 10 minutes.
That was excellent. Can you, I'll just ask a question, and if anybody else wants to ask Alexandra a question, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand, but can you give a little, like, what does the toolkit include and how do you think people will use it?
So I would say, I feel like when I was designing the toolkit, I had different audiences in mind because I feel like nothing is one size fits all. So I would say if someone is a manager, and for instance, someone may have a manager and the manager might have the will, they may be willing to change certain things in the workplace. I think these are usually the folks that when they come across these particular tools, they can actually help them implement. So some people are doers. So sometimes they may not know. And sometimes coming across that particular tool can be very helpful for them in terms of how do I build this particular workplace that is actually inclusive and so on. So I think that's one of the folks that I had in mind, the doers, that can actually utilize this particular toolkit. But at the same time, sometimes you have people who are, like, to be honest, they are racist. They will never change. That's their belief. That's their core beliefs. However, they also might have a lot of their employees standing up, requesting sort of those particular change and stuff like that. Sometimes it can show up as unions. Sometimes it may show up with other people within the organization. Their voices are valued and people tend to listen to them more to a certain extent. And this can also be those folks coming across this particular tool that can actually get the buy-in to make some shift within the organization. So I think these are the folks in terms of looking at it from an institutional perspective, supervisors that can be CEOs, that can be directors, that I was thinking about when I was designing the toolkit. But on the flip side, I also was thinking about also refugees and immigrants who are entering the workplace, sometimes who may not know their rights in the workplace, and also may not know what are the things that are out there for me as I am moving up the ladder, one, but also what does that look like to be in this particular workplace? So I think they will also find very helpful tools, helpful information in terms of how do you get a coach? What does that look like? How do you find a mentor, for instance? And sometimes some people may not even know, like, what is a professional development? Does my company even offer a professional development? It depends. Some may not. So these are different terms that people may not be familiar with, that in reading it, they can say, oh, I didn't know about this, or now that I know, let me try to inquire a little bit more as I am thinking about my career, or I'm trying to build my career in this specific new country, I would say.
Thank you so much.